Okay, so we have a new episode of Legends and Leaders, and today it's great to have Leigh here. Leigh, you've been, so impactful in the world of sports for, as long as anyone can remember, pretty much. I mean, you've been negotiating some of the most important deals for athletes, help take care of them, their families, also just, kind of raise the bar as to what athletes can get. And you've done that with a lot of grace and care for all parties. You've also been instrumental in a movie that's captured the minds of so many people of what the world of sports and agencies can be like with Jerry Maguire. And you've written, some incredible books too to give back from the journey you've had to help other people that want to grow. So I'm excited to have you here and to get into your story.
Thank you.
Awesome. So how did your interest, in the world of sports and wanting to be somebody who would represent athletes, like how did this passion of yours, begin?
Well, I had a father who was a ex-athlete, played basketball at UCLA, and so growing up in Los Angeles in the 50s, we went to UCLA game, we went to Dodger games, we went to Laker games, we went to Ram games. And so we're all big sports fans, and some of your viewers won't remember this, but we used to fight over the sports section in the morning and who got to read it first. Um, so I grew up in Los Angeles and went a year to UCLA and then went up to Cal Berkeley. And I got involved in student politics. I was student body president at the same time the governor of California was Ronald Reagan. And we demonstrated against the war in Vietnam, and he would crack down. And I learned everything I needed to learn about the art of negotiating from dealing with Governor, later President Reagan. Um, but I was a dorm counselor working my way through law school in an undergrad dorm, and they moved the freshman football team into the dorm, and one of the students was the quarterback, Steve Bartkowski. So there really was no field to aspire to, Ben. There was sports agentry was really rudimentary. As a matter of fact, you could call up a team and say you represented a player, and they could just slam the phone down and say, we don't deal with agents. So that's how it began. And so Bartkowski ended up the first player picked in the first round of the NFL draft and um, asked me to represent him. And there I was, brimming with legal experience. But I had gotten out of law school in 73 and then traveled for a year. And in late 74, he talked to me about representing him. And I never had a chance to take the other legal jobs that I was offered. So that began. And then in that very first experience, my dad had two core values. One was treasure relationships, especially family. And the second was try to make a meaningful difference in the world and help people who couldn't help themselves. So I was looking for a career where I could make an impact. And when we got to Atlanta the night before the signing, we get to the airport and there's Klieg lights flashing in the sky like a movie premiere, huge crowds pressed up against the police line. And the first thing we heard was, we interrupt the Johnny Carson show to bring you a special news bulletin. Steve Bartkowski and Leigh Steinberg have just arrived. And I was astonished because I saw where athletes were the movie stars, celebrities. They were the admired figures. And I thought, well, if I could have them go back to their high school community and retrace their roots and set up a scholarship fund or work with the church or Boys and Girls Club. And then at the collegiate level, endow something at the school and stay close to those alums. And then at the pro level, set up a charitable foundation, which would take some cause the athlete cared about, and then take the leading political figures, business figures, and community leaders and put them on an advisory board. They could make a real impact. And so that was 51 years ago, and here we are.
So why do you think that he wanted you to represent him? Like, what do you think he saw in you?
I think the most important skill in any of this is listening skills. Can you draw out another human being and cut below the surface responses to get deeper into what someone's real priorities and values are? And so if you can understand someone's deepest anxieties and fears and their greatest hopes and dreams, and put your head in another person's heart and mind, and I think that as I was the dorm counselor, people would come up and talk. And so that relationship was not dissimilar to what would happen with an agent and a player.
Hmm. So just listening, you would think it's just such a basic skill, but it was so important.
It is. I mean, if you can not think about yourself, but think about how to draw out the other person, and peel back the layers of the onion little by little until you get to someone's core. But if you can bond at that deep emotional level, then you can work your way through life gracefully.
So what were some of like the techniques, Lee, that you used to take your agency from, your business from one person to a lot more, eventually, representing over 300 different athletes? How'd you scale?
It was a philosophy of role modeling, and it was profiling players. So I began to realize that if someone was bright, from a good family, cared about role modeling, cared about second career, that was an athlete that I'd appeal to.
Uh,
And if none of that was important to them and all they wanted was money, that would, nothing wrong with that, but that would probably not be my ideal candidate. So football grew pretty quickly, and I realized early on it was the quarterback that was a key position. And so from the early days of Bartkowski and Warren Moon and Ken O'Brien and Tony Eason and Eric Hipple and a number of players, it just sort of organically grew. And then I started representing baseball players very early too. I had the American League batting champion Carney Lansford back in the mid 70s, and and that expanded. And then ultimately we did basketball and some lottery picks like Greg Anthony with the New York Knicks. And then it spread into boxing, where Oscar De La Hoya asked me to help him, and later Lennox Lewis. So, and then Olympic athletes. But football grew to the point where I had 90 clients, and about 80 of them had made the Pro Bowl. And then had the very first pick in the 64 first round draft picks and the very first pick in the first round 8 times.
Mhm. It's fascinating that you say the values are so important, because so much of what you look at externally is, oh, this player signs for this amount of money, and you see the extravagant lifestyle. But for you, it was the value set. You have to have a value set that's going to make this a long-term relationship for the athlete and for yourself and for the agency.
Right.
It's fascinating. So, negotiations is a major piece of being an agent and of helping, these athletes out. How did your negotiating skills, Lee, evolve over time? Like, what were some new things that you learned from as you scaled in terms of who you were representing that you implemented?
Um, it was to learn the business and be able to put myself in the heart and mind of an owner. It
Mhm.
was understanding their needs. It was having an intimate understanding of contract terms and being more creative and thinking outside the square. Um, for years and years, there was very little leverage, and now we have salary caps. So it's understanding how to what the needs of the teams are and trying to craft a win-win uh, scenario where we come away maximally compensated, but the team gets what they want also.
Mhm.
And um, so it's clearly understanding that once you've done a big deal, it's no time to brag. You sort of move along. And uh, but, but again, also clearly prioritizing what the items are in a negotiation. In other words, if it's term or signing bonus or salaries or incentives or term length. It's having a clear concept going into a negotiation about what's most critical. Because if everything is as critically important, every last point, then it's really hard to make a deal.
Hmm. So you really thought about what these owners wanted. It wasn't just we're just going to get as much money as possible from the players. It was we have to think about both sides.
No, I went to owners and I said, look, we're doing this wrong. When we have acrimonious negotiations with players, all we're doing is pushing away fans. And when we have bad collective bargaining agreements, we're millionaires against billionaires, we're alienating fans again. And what we really ought to be doing is building the brand. So the point is the real competition for football is baseball, basketball, home box office, Walt Disney World, Netflix, and every other form of discretionary entertainment spending. So instead of savaging each other in negotiations, let's think about, could we have an NFL network? Could we use the internet and create content? Could we build out stadia that had ancillary revenue rights and in essence create a bigger pie and keep our negotiations behind the scenes.
So, a lot of people know of the Jerry Maguire movie. That movie did very well. How much involvement, Lee, did you really have in shaping that and what came out, for that Tom Cruise picture?
So in 1993, Cameron Crowe, who's the writer director, came to me and asked if he could follow me around and pick up atmosphere for a film that would involve a sports agent. And so we began a journey, and he came with me to the league meetings where I was showing off free agents in Palm Desert. He came with me to draft when Drew Bledsoe was the first pick in the first round. He was there in New York. He flew up to the press conference with Bill Parcells. He came to games. He came to pro scouting day at USC. And through the process, I told him stories, lots and lots of stories. And he went off and wrote a script. And so his technical advisor, my job was to vet the script,
Uh,
make sure the willing suspension of disbelief that holds you in the motion picture didn't get broken, that you didn't think the dialogue was phony or the look was wrong. And then he assigned me some of the actors like Cuba Gooding Jr., who I took down to the Phoenix Super Bowl and made him pretend he was my wide receiver client all week. And he hung out with Desmond Howard and Amani Toomer. Um, and so there's a lot of, I actually showed the quarterback in the film played by Jerry O'Connell how to throw a spiral because
uh,
he'd gone to NYU and they didn't have a football program there. So, and for the last 26 years, every time I go out to an airport or to a restaurant, somebody inevitably runs up to the table and either says four words to me or asks me to say them, which start with "Show me the."
that's great. So, were you surprised by how successful the film was? Like, what did you think was going to happen with it, and how did it affect your career, personally?
Well, it created a recognition level because I played a cameo in it, but it was pretty clear that Cameron was doing the research with me and figuring it out, and we were around each other a lot of places. So it was profile raising. I think for agents, it
Uh,
gave a more balanced view of the true caring that can be in those relationships. And so, and it was the highest grossing sports film of all time until The Blind Side came out.
Mhm. Yeah, I think like that point about agents, it made agents have a very like people view them very differently. It was somebody that could be helpful in many other ways, and that perception changed a lot.
And that created a flood of people wanting to become agents.
Uh, so did you get some good people at your company because of that?
Oh, we do, but people say I only have myself to blame for the fact that but even that film was realistic about the reverses and downsides and challenges.
Mhm. So you built up your agency, and then I think in 1999 you decided to sell it. Like, why was that the right time to sell it, and what were you thinking was next for you at that point?
Because what was happening is that there were a number of major corporations looking to do business in sports, and they wanted to create a structure where you'd have a football agency, baseball, basketball, hockey, golf, tennis, mixed martial arts, boxing, and on and on. And then from that, you could create content, sports theme, motion pictures, television, video games, merchandise, um, and a virtual studio. So what we saw was consolidation. And David Falk, who was the big basketball agent, sold his firm. We had never dreamed you could sell what essentially was a law firm, but that's what we did it. And later they went public and sort of lost their interest in building out, so we had to move on.
So you kind of had to build back up all the way from the beginning again. It seemed like after,
Well, except that having a client base that was pretty large.
yeah, well, that did help. So, like right now, like where you see the sports agency kind of world going, because it seems to be very different from when you started. Now everybody has an agent. Where do you kind of see some of the next like approaches to the space happening? Like where do you see the space going?
Well, NIL changes everything because all of a sudden you have 15-year-olds in high school who are wanting to hire a marketing agent. That's pretty young for me. Our practice always depended on mature people with mature parents. It's a little daunting to think that someone would be 15, but this is a whole new generation. So there's that. So you have a series of mega agencies, and then you have some boutiques, and but still there are endless amounts of projects.
Mhm.
I've taken an interest in finding a way at the end at the fourth quarter or the last drive to peak up productivity and energy in athletes in that critical moment to give someone a competitive advantage. I've also tried to figure out better ways of returning players who are injured to health, because now if you have a left tackle making $25 million, then his backup's got to be someone who probably was an undrafted free agent. So it's a precipitous fall. So I started exploring hyperbaric oxygen and stem cells, nanovi, bimini, a variety of different uh, practices, which I think uh, eventually will integrate into sport, and it'll solve those problems. And then for everybody else in the society, you can live longer or healthier by using some of this methodology. The other thing we found was the first embryonic cures to concussion, because that's always been a big issue for me. And now there's a process called RTMS, that's magnets against the brain, that can take a concussed brain and try to rehabilitate it. And Tommy Shavers and Nestri is um, another concept. So you're just thinking outside the square.
Mhm. So there you've really put a focus on like the science behind this and using that to amplify the players that you have and their success.
Right, but also to introduce it into the sport. I mean, the whole I had a crisis of conscience back in the late 1980s because I'm representing half the starting quarterbacks. They keep getting hit
Huh.
in the head, and we would go to doctors and ask how many is too many, what's the magic number, and they didn't have answers. So we
Huh.
started holding concussion conferences. And the latest one was at the Las Vegas Super Bowl party I threw, which to try to explore this from the standpoint of awareness, prevention, and cure.
So you've had a great relationship with Patrick Mahomes. How did that like relationship begin? And what would you say were some of the things you guys did to help position him to have a lot of success, on the field and off the field?
I don't think he needed much help. He is sort of preternaturally mature with a pristine work ethic, very, very bright,
Mhm.
good visual field, killer arm. But the key, I think, for um, in football today is the concept of the franchise quarterback.
Wow.
And that's someone you can build around for 10 to 12 years, someone you can win because of rather than with, and someone who, in critical situations, the quarterback's thrown a couple interceptions, the crowd is booing, the game's getting out of hand. What does he do then? Can he tune out extraneous can he tune out extraneous chatter? Can he adopt a quiet mind? And can he elevate his level of performance in critical situations, take a team to and through victory? And Patrick has that in spades. How we meet players is generally a function of the parents in most cases have set up screening boards for agents. And so you probably talk to the parents prior to ever talking to the player and and lay out, a plan which is training, path to the draft, first contract, endorsements, in our case, charitable and role modeling events. And so you lay out that plan, and then if it sounds like it aligns with what the family's values are, that's how that evolves.
Hmm. So parents are very involved.
Yes, in our situation, we almost always meet the parent before meeting the player.
Hmm. So, you mentioned the charitable aspects that some of these players have and how that aligns. I mean, you also put a lot of emphasis in your career. You have your leadership institute. Like, what are some things you now want to accomplish in, charity wise?
Well, the same thing is that we have a resurgence of skinheads and hate groups, and I think we need to have a more civil society. So it's training people to fight hate groups and fight racism and anti-Semitism and be able to create a new generation of leadership. The other thing I'm focusing on is trying to educate the next generation so that we have agent academies that teach people how to listen, how to negotiate, how to recruit, how to set up a charitable foundation. We have sports career conferences. So I'm trying to stimulate a next generation of principled, ethical sports professionals. And it could be agentry, but it could be any field. You could work for a team, a league, a conference, an athletic department, sports media, sports philanthropy, sports press.
Wow. I mean, that's pretty well rounded there. So, just the last question I have, Lee. You've done a ton throughout your life. I mean, just a lot, and you've helped a lot of players in their careers. If you had to pick a couple, short term, long term goals that you have now, like what's your big picture vision? Where do you see the next years of your life playing out?
Well, I think that it'll be some involvement with the continuing to service the clients I do have, mostly in football. but then it's working on those special projects we talked about. I just turned in my third book,
Wow.
which is tentatively titled The Comeback, Resilience, Empathy, and What Really Matters. And that probably comes out in around the Super Bowl. So book tours, some entertainment projects, and again, trying to make a difference. I've got this Sporting Green Alliance that takes sustainable technology in wind, solar, recycling, resurfacing, and water, taking it to stadia, arena, and practice fields to drop carbon emissions and energy costs and to transform those venues into teaching platforms, educational platforms, so millions of fans can see a waterless journal or a solar panel and think about how to integrate that into their own homes and businesses.
Sounds like great goals. I mean, I'm definitely excited to see where you're going to have continued impact. I know you've already done a lot for a lot of people, and I'm sure you'll keep going on that path. People should definitely check out your book as well. Thanks for coming on and doing this.
My pleasure.